Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining this podcast. My name is Dr. Irvin Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to Office Hours with Doc. Over the past 30 years, I, like many before me and many after, have devoted my life to America's children and its communities by working within the education ecosystem. In other words, I'm an educator. I've been a teacher. I've been a principal. I've been a district leader. I've been a nonprofit director. I've been a foundation executive. But so many before me have done those jobs, and so many people are doing those jobs, and so many people will do those jobs in the future. However, what we want to do in this podcast is look at individuals and listen to those individuals who are doing those jobs right now in order to do three things. One, we want to hear their stories, understand how they got to where they are, and what they're doing while they're there on behalf of America's children. And let's go beyond America, the world's children, because we have international perspectives that we'll be sharing. So that's the first thing. Number two, we want to better understand how these educators work within the ecosystem, not only as individual actors, because sometimes you have to do that, but more importantly, as team members to have impact. And then number three, speaking of impact, our goal is to hear how we might all work to accelerate our collective effort and impact going forward. These are the voices from the ecosystem that we'll hear in this podcast. If you've ever wondered what's going on in schools or school systems or school districts or however you think about schools in the US and the world and the lives of those individuals who are shaping children's lives, if you've ever wondered that, this is the podcast for you. Office Hours with Doc. Welcome. Welcome back to Office Hours with Doc. This is Dr. Irvin Scott. My students refer to me as Doc. But I am just delighted to have one of my former students and an individual doing some amazing work in the state of Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia. And my friend and sister, Inella Ray. I am just really, really excited to have her. In a second, I'm going to have her just say hello to you, everyone. But let me just remind you, this is season 2 of Office Hours with Doc. We wrapped up season 1 a couple of months ago and have been working on season 2. And I'm just really, really excited to have Inella. Inella, thank you so much for joining us here on Office Hours with Doc.
Absolutely, absolutely. This feels so full circle.
Wonderful. It's full circle indeed, because Inella was one of my students. Oh, and she just graduated about a year or so from now, as has um, my co-producer, Rudy Luters and Nida, so many amazing students in that first cohort of the online education leadership program. But let me just jump right into it. Inella, if someone were to ask you, what's your leadership trajectory? Like, how did you land where you are now? But start back as far back as you want to, and bring us up to where you are now.
Mm.
And then we'll take.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that question. Um, and this feels very heartening for me because I don't know if you know, Dr. Scott, but I actually mentioned you in my statement of intent when I applied to
Oh,
Hugsy. So
I
this
didn't know
does
that.
really feel very full circle for me. My leadership journey. Wow. So I kind of got into the space that I am here today, really in a non-linear way. I didn't
Hmm.
have direct ambition to be directly in child advocacy or even go to Hugsy. Really, I had this deep desire to make the world better in some way. I always kind of had that feeling as a kid. I was always deeply disgruntled about injustice in any way, whether that showed up through just us playing hide and seek, and I feeling like somebody wasn't being fair with the roles. And then it became a little bit more serious when I always had to go to a school that was never in my neighborhood. So
Mm.
when my friends could walk to school, I always had to travel to school. And I always wonder why that was. And so that curiosity really led me to ask the question of like, why are things the way that they are? So I started paying attention to certain things, like when I would take the elevated train to school, and I would see where certain demographics of people got off and where others stayed. I, I was seeing that many of my neighborhood friends were going to the neighborhood school, and we were having very different homework assignments.
Mm.
I was also noticing that gun violence was something that I was simply used to. So all these different things were things that I was seeing at a very young age. And so at a very young age, I became curious about like how can I be a part of making things better. And so when I was in 12th grade, AP Government and Politics, I had the privilege of being in this program that the University of Pennsylvania was doing at a local magnet school that I happened to be at. And I got introduced to constitutional law. And I fell in love with that. And I think I more so fell in love with the fact that I didn't have to accept injustice as it was, but I could actually use the tools that I had to actually course correct things that I saw. And so fast forward, I'm at Temple undergrad and I'm majoring in economics. And I had this deep desire to want to go to law school. And then I'm getting closer to graduation. And I'm just like, I don't think I want to go directly to law school. And so I was trying to balance like my dreams with also the reality that I need to get a job. And so I initially took my first job was in corporate America, and I was doing asset management work. And it felt very, I felt very disconnected from what I
Mm.
was doing. I felt like I was like doing something absolutely for a paycheck. And I felt my spirit like deflating across that
Mm.
2 year period that I was there. And so I remember I had went to a conference where Susan L. Taylor, who used to be the head of Essence magazine, and she was talking about purpose and making sure that you're doing something that is tethered to something more than just you. And I remember going up to her. I was just crying. And I was just like, I'm not, you don't have to like listen to like my story, but I just want to say thank you.
Mm.
Like you've given me permission in a way that you probably don't know. And so after that moment, I made the decision to leave corporate America. And
Mm.
so that was my initial pivot into education. And so I went from doing asset management work to then going into education. And I had like little reminders before then that told me that I wanted to do this kind of work. And I would say the most sliding door moment for me was when I actually went to Haiti. So it was the first time I was outside of the country, and it was spring break, and it was for a service trip. And I was just like, I don't know if I will be able to get my passport in time. I don't know if my parents are going to have like a heart attack with me being out of the country. And I just was able to get everything together. And that week, it was just a week, but it changed my life. I was able to connect with 12 kids. I stayed at an orphanage, and many of the kids that were there were were children of people who perished back in the earthquake
Mm.
that happened. And so not many of them spoke English. I didn't speak French or Creole, but we were able to develop this deep connection that was bonded by something deeper. And it taught me something about humanity. So after that, I like decided for myself that like I want to do something focused on, making things better in some way, but I just didn't know the how just yet.
Mm.
And so I zigzagged my way from like post-secondary counseling to then out of school time space to then like teacher recruitment stuff to then like school operations. And now, present day, I'm doing advocacy work, but I'm doing it with the people who I think are the best. And that's parents, caregivers, and anybody really playing an outsized role in raising children. And I think it's the best role because one, the parents that I work with keep me very laser focused on integrity, right?
Mhm.
They're always keeping me close to what is true. And now I'm at this space where I'm not giving anybody a voice. I'm actually just reminding them of what's already there and that they have so much individual power as themselves, but what also might be possible if we bring that power together for things that we are individually feeling, and what will it look like if we use that to actually change material conditions for people. And so that's the work that I get to do today. And so all these different things that have touched me have
Mhm.
reminded me the deep importance of first always caring about people and their wholeness.
Mhm.
Um, and so that continues to guide me and to lead me. And now I feel like my path is being directed by my purpose. I don't really I don't say I don't reach for anything anymore, but it feels like it's I'm attracting it now. So it feels different. So that's a little bit about my trajectory.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So many different ways that I want to follow up on. But because you started with Inella, the little girl, who was
Hmm.
bothered by, you wouldn't describe it necessarily at that time, perhaps, as injustice, but that's what it was. And do you feel
Hmm.
like in some ways you were chasing those same injustices and trying to do something about it in the work that you do now? And take us, oh, incidentally, I'm assuming you were in Philadelphia growing up. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes,
Okay, what part of Philly?
that
Because I know
is.
people
That
are
is.
listening. They're like, "Oh, she's from
West
Philly,
Philadelphia. West
West."
Philadelphia, born and raised.
You know the rest of that rap too,
Yes.
I'm sure.
Yes, I do.
And didn't he just have a street that was named after him?
He, yes, he did. Yes, he did.
Okay. All
Yes.
right. All right. So West Philadelphia, those of you who know West, okay, for those people who don't know West Philadelphia and Ella, before I go to what are you doing
Mhm.
now and the way you're going after
Yeah.
injustice now, how would you describe West
Yeah.
Philadelphia as you were growing up? And maybe how would you describe it now?
Yeah. So I want to first and get very granular about like Philly because I love my city. But Philly has been historically a Black city,
Mm-hmm.
and it's still a Black majority city. And West Philadelphia is this conclave of brilliance of Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
And that has shifted in some ways because we're also the home to a lot of institutions, right? So we're the home to University of Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? We're the home to Drexel University, University of Sciences. So you have these universities that are sitting at the intersection of a large community that was referred to as the Black Bottom. And so many of the people who historically were there have been displaced across the city or in different parts of West Philly. But West Philly has always been a place to me of deep resistance,
Mm-hmm.
reverence, um, and also community. So I would say Philadelphia as a larger city is very segregated. But West Philly has like this weird energy where even with gentrification happening, there are people just finding a way to be in community with one another across difference that I think is really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be rooted here, to have been raised here, to have rode my bike around here, to have walked around in places like 52nd Street, like there's just so much history. Also, like the musical history, the arts, like
Mm-hmm.
all of that is here. And so that has absolutely played a role in who I am today and how I show up. But it also reminds me of the amount of work that needs to be done.
Mm,
Philadelphia is also the largest poorest city. Philadelphia is also home to the largest family separation rate that disproportionately impacts Black moms, right? When you think about
mm,
the underfunding of our school district, even in Philly, but also across the state, Philadelphia is $1.4 billion underfunded, right? So when you
mm,
think about these things, right, in a city where we, it's pretty much the birth of the United States,
mm,
it's a complicated place. And I would say Philadelphia has very much, and West Philly in particular, has very much politicized me in a lot of ways.
mm. It's a complicated place, but what I also hear is a deep commitment and love for the place from you. Am I hearing that correctly?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, it comes through beautifully. One
Yes.
real quick personal note. You said 52nd Street, and I did grow up uh, attending a church. I am assuming 50th and Callahill is West Philadelphia. Does that 50th? Would
Yes.
50th be West Philadelphia? Okay, so I grew up
Yes.
attending the church quite a bit, 50th and Callahill. It was called, well, the preacher was Bishop O.T. Jones. And so I spent a lot of time. It wasn't too far from the elevated train. That's the other thing that I remember about it.
Yep. Yep.
So I've got this sort of
Yep.
deep personal connection.
That's the L. Yep.
Yeah, that's the L.
Hmm.
So talk a little bit about how your work is playing out right now, and particularly how are you chasing after these injustices through the work that you do? Who do you
Yeah.
work for? What's your role?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I'm the director of parent advocacy and engagement at Children First. So for those who don't know, we're a regional political advocacy organization. And so we fight for kids across early childhood education, K-12 education, child health, including both their mental health, but also their physical health, and then also juvenile justice and child welfare. So the work that I do is really trying to change this dynamic where policy decisions are made without families.
Mm,
And what we're are particularly about is improving the life and life chances of Black, brown, and low income children. And so when we think about who their parents are, they tend to be the furthest away from these conversations, right?
mm,
And it's not because they don't have a voice. It's not because they don't have anything of meaning to say or that for lack of caring. It's because oftentimes they're treated with hostility, their silence, and in many cases, places like schools, like in Philadelphia, has had like a very contentious relationship because these schools were hostile places to them,
mm,
right? So now, as a parent, they're coming into these same institutions that in some ways wrong them, and now they're having to fight for their child. And so the work that I'm doing now is trying to like flip this dynamic where parents are not actually a part of the process to actually parents being not only involved in the process, but actually leading the
mm,
process. And so when I first started this work back in 2021, it was all about, well, what if we gave parents the tools that we know how to use in the policy space and teach them those things and get them together with other people who are equally passionate about these issues and
mm,
see what happens. And what we've learned is that one, I don't know if you heard this sentiment, Dr. Scott, but I've heard it often that parents don't care, parents are lazy,
I've heard it.
and parents don't have the capacity. And I've always heard that perspective really, really as like coded language, from my perspective. And it
Mm,
felt like coded language that they were talking about Black, brown, and poor parents. And so what I try to do with my work is one, letting people know that like they're not alone, right? So the first part of this is actually bringing people together and letting them
mm,
know hey, this thing that's happening to you at the school or with an early intervention or within the juvenile justice system is also happening to this parent over here.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have in common? And then there's this thing around what are your gifts, right? And then how can you use those gifts woven together with somebody else to actually push things forward? And so some of the work that we've been doing recently that I'm really excited about that's gaining more momentum is the work we started off with doing 2 years ago, which was work around expulsion and suspension in pre-K
Mm.
settings. And so some people may be like, what? Pre-K? I didn't even know that like even existed. But it does. And it's a very, I call it the invisible visible problem because it's invisible because it's not tracked in a meaningful way. And that's because, providers in early childhood education are not documenting this in ways that actually begin to tell a story about who's this actually happening to.
Mm.
But then the other piece is some families don't even know that they're actually being expelled or
Wow.
suspended, right? They're getting just phone calls of like, can you pick up such and such early today? Such and such is having a tough time today. And then, or they're getting a push out that's similar to, hey, we don't think this could work out anymore. And that's the end of it in just one day. So, what I learned across these last 2 years is not only how much that's happening to people, but also how other systems are contributing to that phenomenon. And
Mm-hmm.
so early intervention is one of those things. And so, for those who don't know, early intervention is a system that helps supports kids 0 to 5 with, either developmental delays and a child needing extra support. And what I've heard directly from families in Philly is that they had so many challenges with accessing early intervention, from getting their child evaluated to then even get the services and then having services continue with fidelity. And
Mm.
why that's particularly important is because when we think about things like early intervention, the data shows that if a child gets early intervention, they are 50% less likely to be in special education.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question becomes, why aren't we doing more work to help make sure the kids who actually need those supports are getting those supports without challenges and barriers? But what's actually happening, so I've talked to families who have young children now, all the way to people who have children my age or older. And many of them have been funneled from getting pushed out of pre-K, like having their behavior criminalized very, very early, because it falls outside of the range of what's deemed acceptable
Mm-hmm.
or what a provider or educator has tolerance for. And then that trend then follows that child throughout K-12. And in some cases, even if they don't lead into a juvenile detention center, carcinality may happen. Like Dr. Eve Ewing talks about this. So
Mm.
like when we think about all these different things, it felt to me as something that I had to really push to bring to light, to say like parents are telling me all about this in ways that I wasn't even explicitly asking about. So
Mm.
that made me realize that like we got to do something about this. So now we're beginning to build a base of power around people who have not had great experiences with EI or who were not able to access that system
EI meaning
to try to make change. Oh, early intervention.
early intervention.
To
Gotcha.
Yes, to try to make changes so that this is not happening to more and more kids. And so I'm like helping parents at both ends of the spectrum of like their child is in the 0 to 5 range, but I'm also helping parents who are children who are getting abused in juvenile detention centers, right? Who were the kids who didn't get the services they needed way back when. And now everyone is scratching their head around, why is this kid doing X, Y, and Z? But what we know is that no kid is inherently one thing or the other. But where are some of the conditions that we're put in? And so I think in Philly, we have not fundamentally given our kids a fair starting chance. And that's why I'm in the work that I'm doing, because initially I wanted to be in law, But then I was just like, I don't want to be in the courtroom at the end of the spectrum. I
Mm-hmm.
actually want to be at the beginning to try to, you know, move the things that need to be moved to create the conditions, like I'm thinking of Dr. Mapp with parent engagement work. She talks
Mm-hmm.
about like creating the conditions. And I'm thinking about what are the conditions necessary to make sure a child can thrive. And part of that, I think, is not having low expectations of kids that are Black, brown, and low income. I think the other piece of this is to make sure that we have policies that protect children and families and don't prioritize what's convenient and easy, but what's actually necessary and hard that's going to make the difference for kids. And
Mm-hmm.
so I say all this to say that I'm really excited about doing this work in partnership with people who care the most about kids. And that's the parents, caregivers, the community, moms, aunties, and dads and block captains that pour into children day in and day out. And they're learning how to build power with one another and challenge the power apparatus, which I think is pretty cool.
One of the things that I'm thinking about, you're sharing such rich information as you talk about the work you're doing. And a lot of our listeners will be from Philadelphia, but they'll be
Mhm.
beyond Philadelphia. If a parent, and occasionally we'll have listeners who are parents, right? If a parent's like, you know what, she's talking about something that I feel my kid is dealing with, like from your own sort of space of and knowledge within the Philadelphia ecosystem, what would you tell that parent, even if they're not in Philadelphia? Where should they go? Where should they start if they feel like, you know what, this is happening to my kid and he or she is only in preschool?
I think it's the first is acknowledging that their child and themselves like are owed the best education.
Mm.
And if it's not given to you, then you fight for it. And it's unfair that so many of our families have to actually advocate vigorously to get the things that they ought to have at a baseline. I think that's the very first thing, to know that it is your job to make sure your child gets the best education possible. I think the second thing is to really understand the power of what it is to be in community with other people. This
Good.
work is far too big. It's far too systemic to go at this alone. And so I think it's really, really important for people to understand that, like, yes, you have individual power that you should exercise by all means, but that power linked with other people's power, that's what's going to shift things, not just for your child, but for all children. I think that's a fundamental thing that we're about, right? So if somebody is coming into this, and is having trouble with their child, of course we're going to help them, right? But the idea is to move them from a place of just being concerned about their kid to all children, right? Because that's why I'm in the work. It's not just for my younger sisters, my nieces and nephews. It's because I think all children are deserving of this. And so when I'm in partnership with other people, that's a core value that we stretch across the work.
Mm, I love that. First, acknowledge that you deserve the best and your child deserves the best. And don't even try to do this by yourself is the way I would characterize it. That's powerful. Let me ask you this. Talk a little bit about, okay, how did I did you say children's first? Children first?
Children first. Yep.
Children first. Talk a
Uh-huh.
little bit about where children first sits in this ecosystem, whether it's school district,
Yeah.
policymakers, foundations, like where does children first sit? And then one other thing, you use the word advocacy, and I think to myself, well, there may be parents who are like, what does she mean by advocacy? So talk a little bit
Yep.
about where children first sits in the ecosystem
Yep.
and how you leverage the various parts, and also what you mean when you say advocacy.
Absolutely. So, Children First is an advocacy organization. So, I'll explain advocacy in a second. But what we do is we push, and I'm using push as the key word here, in that we push folks in the school district, research, lawmakers,
Mm.
philanthropy. Like we're pushing all these different entities to think differently about the problems that are chronic in a way that actually moves the needle. And so when I say advocacy, I'm not talking about organizing. So organizes is when people actually speak on the behalf of issues impacting them, right? And I think organizing is great and it's needed. Advocacy is actually when you're helping people, like you're speaking on the behalf of people. So while we have parent advocates, right, they're speaking not only for themselves, but also on the behalf of other people experience a similar problem. And so Children First has been around for 45 years. And yeah, so this is our 45th year being here. But we've been the people who have always been banging down a door about children. We were the people who passed the lead law in Philadelphia to make sure that um, if you have like a house that it's actually getting expected for to make sure that there's not lead poison in there, right? Because we know how old Philadelphia's housing infrastructure, and there's a lot of babies who are getting poisoned by lead paint, right? And then are having developmental delays as a result. Then we have things like the soda tax, which created the PHL pre-K, which is a universal pre-K program. We were the first people in the country to pass a tax on soda, right? Because Philadelphia was saying we don't got money for this. So we were like, well, we gonna find the money. And my executive director, Donna Cooper, is a whiz, right? She used to work for Ed Rendell back in the day, both at the city level, but then also at the state. And she was behind helping to get so much money to schools prior to the core cuts, right? That Philadelphia, I would say, is still really trying to deal with. Children First was a part of the coalition efforts of the fair funding lawsuit that happened in PA, where they said the way in which we fund our schools is unconstitutional, and we're pushing Harrisburg to get more money to our schools that they've been owed for years. That we just got a win that said and a court that says it. And so now we're putting more heat to our folks in Harrisburg to make sure our kids get what they need. And so Children First, I would say, are are the people who are reminding everybody else who works on these issues
Mhm.
of who we're actually doing the work for,
Yeah.
right? And so I think it really speaks to the name, right? So we're not anchored in prioritizing educators first, our providers first, our policies first, our parent. We're prioritizing children first.
Children.
And so we're thinking about what are all the different things that need to happen for a kid to thrive. And we're really doing that in a very unapologetic way. And while we think it's really important to be in partnership with a lot of people, so we don't do this work alone, but we do push folks along who may not be ready to do the thing. And so that's why I think we're the leading advocacy organization in this region, because we do the thing that often is not popular because we know it's what's best for kids. And so this
Mm.
expulsion and suspension work I mentioned is the invisible visible problem, right? And so I say all this to share that like children first, I think is like the heartbeat in the state.
Mm. That's so good. I don't want to let you go without asking two questions.
Okay,
One
I got you.
is, one is how you're making sense of what's going on in the country today as it relates to education. And you can answer that question however you want to in just a minute or so. And then two, I want to end on a positive note and um, I think I heard some news about you personally. And so if you want to share that, especially as it relates to how you sustain
Yes,
yourself beyond just work, 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 that would be
absolutely.
great to share. So we'll start off with
Okay.
the rougher question first.
Okay. Yeah, it's hard because it changes daily, right? But I would say the work feels even more important now. And I'm finding that there's an opening too that's happening where in change making, when people start to feel more of a deeper sense of urgency to act, there becomes this like opening of people who maybe wouldn't get engaged if the outside conditions were better. But because the conditions are so precarious, people are now feeling like maybe I ought to do something,
Mm,
right? And so that silver lining has really grounded me in a way. And I think the other piece is our ancestors have been here before, right? Maybe it's not the same terrain exactly. In some cases, I think it was worse. Um,
absolutely.
but they found ways, subversive ways, right? Trisha Hersey talks about this, but subversive ways to find joy, right? To remain tethered to the things that are deeply valuable to you, even when the larger order of things is contradictory to that, right?
Mhm.
And I think it's also revolutionary right now to stand in your values and to have integrity on things, right?
Absolutely.
And I think in some ways, for me, it's given me more clarity,
Hmm.
right? Of what my focus is, of what I ought to be doing, and how I ought to be using my gifts.
Beautiful.
I guess it's like my ancestors would say, we don't got time to play. And
That's
so
right.
that's where I'm at now. We don't got time to play. And, you know, everybody is human, right? So none of us are, we're all infallible, right? And so I keep that centered and also know that like we're smart, right? And the people that I'm with every day are so big-hearted. I gotta believe that's way more powerful than people who are individualistic, people who
Hmm.
are only thinking about a few versus a larger segment of people. And so that's what keeps me hopeful. But it's hard. It's not easy. And then for
The
personal news,
positive note.
yes, it's so funny, Dr. Scott, too. So I met Aaron, who's now my fiance. Um, yes, love that man. But I met him because I was supposed to be interviewing him to join a board. And so we met because we were deeply aligned and wanting to change like public schools in Philly by building parent power. So we
Mm,
met under the guise of Let Every Voice Philly. And he wind up not joining joining the board, but we wind up connecting. And he's actually a son of educators, which is ironic
mm,
too. And we actually had like our first date on the block that I grew up as a child. So like on Pine Street, right down the street from Malcolm X Park, where I used to ride my bike. And so I say that to say that like when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, everything falls into place. So if I never made that leap from corporate America, I would have never met him. And so I think it's really a testament to if you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, everything will fall into place at its appropriate time. Um, so I'm very thankful.
wow. What a beautiful way to end this podcast session. Anella, thank you so much. We wish you and Aaron the best.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much for coming and joining us and speaking from the heart about the work that, not the heart and soul about the
Mhm.
work that you do on behalf of children in West Philadelphia and beyond. Philadelphia
Yes,
and
yes.
beyond the state of Pennsylvania. All
Yep,
right, my sister, thank you so much.
of
We
course.
appreciate Inella joining us, and we appreciate you joining us for Office Hours with Doc. Have a great one, everyone.